18% of the light strikes off it, and that's why it looks great. Glorious. I'm supposed to be doing a video right now on how to use a light meter. First day where it's been 20 degrees. Absolutely glorious. In this video, I'm going to take you through one of the most important tools in my camera bag, my light meter. I'm going to show you the way I meter to determine the correct exposures for my type of photography. The light meter that I use is a Sekonic L508 Zoom Master. It has an incident meter and it has a spot meter. And for me as a film photographer, a spot meter is a key thing that you need in a light meter. I'm going to show you how you meter blacks, how you meter the highlights, how you meter the averages using a gray card, and how and when you'd use an incident meter. One of the first things you're going to want to do is set up your meter. There's a couple of things you need to know about setting up your meter. The first thing you want to do is set your ISO. You hold the button down and you put the ISO to the box speed of film that you're using. The second thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to decide if you're going to use the incident meter or the spot meter. Right now I'm using the incident meter. The third thing you're going to want to do is set the shutter speed. By moving this speed up dial here, you can see I've used this meter quite a bit, you control the shutter speed. So you set the shutter speed where you want it on your camera, and then here on this button, you push this button, and then this gives you your exposure reading. So for this light, my exposure reading would be 1/25 at f2.8.5 at 800 ISO film. If you want to use it on spot metering, you have to turn this dial here to the spot meter function. From there, you look through the spot meter window, and then you can zoom in and out how close you want the spot to meter. And wherever your spot is in the photograph, it will give you an accurate reading of your exposure. Ansel Adams used to talk about pre-visualization, how the end photograph was going to look even before he took that photograph. And in black and white, he used to think, is there going to be really, really deep rich blacks? Is the scene just going to be gray? Is it going to be super contrasty? He knew exactly how that photograph was going to look when he was taking the picture, in part because he knew how to meter and he knew where to meter. Knowing where and how to meter for your final exposure will help you achieve those results. And whether you're shooting black and white film, color negative film, color slide film, each has its own characteristics, and you want to meter appropriate for the appropriate film that you're shooting. When you're shooting color slide film, it can have deep, rich blacks, even if you underexpose it. Underexposing slide film will give you deep, rich blacks, really luscious colors. But the drawback with shooting color slide film is that if you overexpose it, the highlights will be blown out and there'll be no detail there. Blowing out highlights on color slide film doesn't look great. And if you're shooting color negative film, underexposing color negative film will give you deep, muddy blacks. Overexposing color negative film will retain the detail and retain a really nice look in the highlights. So oftentimes I will overexpose color negative film from the box speed. So if the box speed is 160, I'll probably set the ISO to 80 ISO. So setting the film to 80 ISO will overexpose this 160 ISO film by one stop. And if you're shooting black and white film, it's important to know how and where to read the tones. Knowing those key things will give you those lush, long tonal ranges in black and white photographs. So this scene is a perfect example of when I could use my incident meter on my light meter. It's evenly lit, there's no harsh shadows, there's no highlights. If I take a meter reading, it's going to tell me exactly what to set my camera on, and I'm going to have a correct exposure, whether I'm shooting black and white, color negative, or color slide. And this isn't a scene that you'd want to underexpose or overexpose. You're going to have one exposure that's going to be the correct exposure for a scene like this. Using a spot meter. A spot meter takes a reading off the particular spot that you are pointing your meter at. When you take a spot meter reading off any subject, it will give you an exposure that will produce gray and black and white, or gives you an exposure that will reproduce that subject area with detail in color. Your highlights and shadows will fall off in either direction. The problem is if you do a meter reading on something dark or black, it will not turn out dark or black, it will turn out gray or be washed out and lacking depth and color. Same with white. It will not turn out white, it will turn out gray in black and white, or muddy gray in color. Your midtones will go dark and blacks will become muddy with no detail at all, especially with color negative film. So you have to do one of two things. Take a meter reading of the darks and of the whites and average the two, or take a meter reading, then compensate on the blacks or whites for the correct reading. Take a meter reading of the blacks, then underexpose the image by 1 stop to 1.5 stops, making the dark area of the image darker and closer to how it should look. And same with the whites. Overexpose the image by 1 to 1.5 stops and make the light tones go light. So an example is if my meter reading is 1/500th of a second at f8 on a dark subject, I need to underexpose it by setting my aperture to f11 or f11.5 to make those darks go dark. And conversely, if I take a meter reading off a white subject and my meter reading is 1/500th of a second at f11, I need to overexpose that photograph and I need to move the aperture to f8 or f5.6 to get the correct reading for a white subject. Now another piece of valuable equipment I never leave home without is a gray card. It's a $10 gray card, and what this does is it reflects 18% of the light that hits it. So if you take a meter reading off of it, it gives you an average exposure, and it also gives you the correct exposure for the sunlight hitting it. To use a gray card, you hold it the same way your subject is going to be lit by the light. And then you take a meter reading off of it, and that gives you the correct average exposure. Now the other thing to remember is if your subject is very dark, you need to increase your calculated exposure by 1/2 to 1.5 stops, depending on how dark it is. If your subject is very light, you need to decrease your calculated exposure by 1/2 to 1.5 stops. But using a gray card gets you in the ballpark of the correct exposure very quickly. One of the other things you want to remember is if it's a really tricky lighting situation is to bracket. Take one picture at a meter reading and then take another picture that's a 1/2 stop under, take another picture that's a 1/2 stop over, and then you'll have 3 photos and you'll have one of the photos that is very close to the right exposure. Bracketing is always a way of saving the day, especially when you're shooting film. Well, I hope you enjoyed that introduction into using your light meter. Don't forget to subscribe, give me a like, leave me a comment. I plan on doing more on light meters and going more in depth, doing some stuff at night. Anyway, cheers, everyone stay safe.